Hi everybody. So this I've put off making this last video, with this last look at real life incidents and historical events in Maine that influenced it by Stephen King, which is my all-time favorite King novel and my one of my favorite horror novels, and then probably in the top 5 or 10 of my favorite novels of all time. So, um, and the reason I've put this off is that it's an uncomfortable subject to talk about in general, but I think it's also a really ugly part of history, and it's still going on today. Um, the second interlude section of the book deals head on with the racism that the Hanlon family faces. Now, as a white person, 30 however many years after the book was published, I think it's an important subject to have a conversation about. But as a writer, I don't know if I would be comfortable taking on the persona of those characters because I don't have any lived experience of the kind of racism that Will Hanlon experiences during the fire at the Black Spot. And also, just simply, the question becomes, is it important to have the conversation, period, regardless of who's writing it, or is it more important that we don't go onto the territory of cultural appropriation when a white writer writes about black characters and their experiences of racism? I can't answer that question. I am sure there are scholars out there who could answer it a great deal better than I could. I would. Some of the horror authors that look at the intersection of race and horror and black creators. I did mention a book about black horror in one of my videos last year. I know Dr. Chesia Burke looks a lot at some of those subjects and themes. There are some others, but anyway, I mean, at the very least, King's book acknowledges it and acknowledges the history of these tensions in Maine's development, and especially the fictional town of Derry, which is based on Bangor, Maine. And it's probably a very ugly part of Maine history. Now, blah, blah, blah. After that really awkward, long-winded intro, I apologize for that. But like I said, it is an uncomfortable subject as somebody who has no lived experience with it. And not even the other side of it. I mean, the Klan is not a thing in Canada. Or maybe it is, but I'm away from it. Growing up modern times, growing up just not part of that. And that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in Canada, but it's so different here. It's so much more covert here. But that's a whole different. I think that's a whole different video. So I'm not going to get too far into that. But the history of black civil rights in Canada is actually quite interesting. Much less violent than the States, but still there. I mean, we're still a country based on colonialism and British entitlement and so on. And a lot of us are, myself included, Scots British, a little bit of Métis in there, and of course our relationship with our Native friends is just deplorable. So I keep getting off topic here. I'm sorry. But the thing that I wanted to look at is I didn't know that the Ku Klux Klan was such a big thing in Maine in the early part of the 20th century. That was a really eye-opening thing to read about. And now there's a paper called The History of Maine, The Rising of the Klan. I'll put the link in the doobly-doo there. But I will assume that King probably did some research and knew about this part of it. In the book, this topic comes up in the context of the fire at the Black Spot. Now, King fictionalizes the group as, rather than the Ku Klux Klan, he says it's a group called the Maine Legion of White Decency, which is a totally fictional group. I'm not sure why he did that. Maybe the Klan's litigious, or maybe the Klan wasn't operating in Bangor in the same way that they were in other cities. But I'm not 100% sure. All right. So now the story in the book goes that Will Hanlon, when he was 16, lied about his age, joined the Army. And he was stationed in Derry, Maine, in an all-black company of, I think they call it enlisted men. They're the lowest ranked guys. And he and the other guys in the company, they called Company B, they would, when they were on leave, they would go into town and they would drink with the kind of side by side with the working guys that were there. And the white rich town people did not like that. So the Army found a shed and said, okay, if you want to have your leisure time, you can go there and do it. So, I mean, what are they going to do, right? So the guys fixed up the shed, and one of them, they got hold of a grill so they could cook, and then over time they figured out that they had a little band, a little Dixieland combo, so they would, every Friday and Saturday night, they would prop open the door and start playing music, and people started showing up. And a lot of the people that started showing up were the young people. A lot of them were students, and a lot of them were the sons and daughters of the people that did not like them drinking in town. So, as I was saying, the Maine Legion of White Decency is made up of largely rich guys who don't like they don't like their kids partying with this company of black dudes from the Army. And so one night, while this place is full of people, they set fire to it. All right, where was I? In case you hadn't noticed, I am at work, and that's why I keep getting interrupted. So they set fire to the Black Spot, and King is very fond of an idea of a menacing force at work when people do horrible things, which would be great, because then there's always an external source, and if there's a monster, the monster can be beaten. Unfortunately, in this case, the evil is the evil in men's hearts. Sorry, I shouldn't do that just when I come back. Where was I going? The evil in men's hearts. Now, the story, within the context of the story, Will Hanlon is telling this to his son as he's dying. He's in his deathbed. He's dying of cancer. And I think Mike's about 16 at the time. 15 or 16. And he mentions that the Ku Klux Klan didn't hadn't gotten as far as Derry, but he mentions that they took hold in a big way in Lewiston. And that is kind of what I was surprised to find out. Now, I'm looking at this paper, and they said that maybe I'll get through this. I just need like 5 minutes. All right. So we think of the Klan as a very fringe thing, but in the 1920s, it says from 1920, Klan membership grew from 23,000 in 1923 to its peak of over 150,000 members by 1925. And just as quickly as those numbers rose, they fell again, with the membership decreasing by almost half in 1926 to 61,000, dwindling further to 3,100, leaving only 226 members in 1930. At its height, membership in the Klan represented 23% of the population of Maine, with the largest groups belonging to communities of Portland, Lewiston, and Brewer. And it rose rapidly because a charismatic leader was able to rally middle-class Protestants around their opposition to immigrants and Catholics. And from what I can gather of this, there were not a lot of Black people in the North in the 1920s. But hate is like a big fart. Sometimes it just has to go somewhere. And again, I never really put the two and two together, but the Klan, a lot of the people from the Klan, they trace their lineage back to the early Puritans who settled the U.S. And they settled because they left Europe because the Catholic Church was too decadent. So there's always this war against the Protestants, right? Big enders and little enders. And the early days of the Klan, this paper that I'm looking at, they talk about how they didn't want the freed slaves to gain political power and integrate into white American society. But by 1915, it was reestablished in Georgia, forming around the idea of Americanism. And it's amazing to me that over 100 years later, that idea hasn't really changed that much. They're concerned about immigration, which they still are. A certain brand of American is deathly afraid that the immigrants are going to come. And it says here, the Klan and supporters of Americanism were struggling to define what it meant to be an American, and as a result, who should be allowed to live in the United States. And so in Maine particularly, a lot of the indigent workers were French Canadian Catholics that came in to work in the timber industry. The timber season was from probably April until it got cold, like around October, November. And I'm just looking through here. And so there was a lot of tension about these Catholics coming in. And there were also Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, all Catholic, right? And then I think later Greek Orthodox as well. They decided they didn't want them. So, and then this book talks about a regional leader by King Kleagle, Eugene Farnsworth, who was a speaker, and I guess he just had that way of rallying, creating that cult of personality. And there's a picture of a KKK parade in 1923. Look at that. Isn't that scary? So one of the main things that they were opposed in the history of Maine, and this is what Mr. Hanlon was referring to, is in 1924, they threatened to march against a group of largely French Canadian Catholics who were trying to unionize. And that's this concept of immigrants and unionization within the timber industry is another one of those kind of underlying themes of unrest in the book that isn't maybe, it's not an overt thing that King references, but it's there. And the other thing that is also kind of covert in the book that I just kind of put 2 and 2 together about is that the fire at the Black Spot takes place in 1930. And this was still right in the throes of Prohibition. And some of the specter of Prohibition was that terrible things happen to people who drink. Now, at the time, Stephen King was also very deeply in the Coke years. And so many of his books at that time have this looming specter of addiction hanging over them. And that's one of the reasons such terrible things happen to addicts and people who drink. It's mentioned when the Volstead Act is repealed, gets a mention in it. But one of the things that Mr. Hanlon makes very clear is that the kids were bringing their own alcohol, but everybody was drinking. So that's kind of a vaguely formed set of specters, but these dairy interludes are much, trying to tie them to real life events in terms of the bloody history of dairy as it relates to some of the more violent history of what happened in Maine is kind of complicated, right? And then the last thing that was that it, hang on. Sorry about that. Okay. And I'm not a historian. I'm just sort of looking at some of the things within Maine history that I found interesting that probably do deserve a deeper dive in a more historical video, but I'm not the one to do it because I'm just not that type of researcher. But the fourth interlude in Derry, or in it, Derry, the fourth interlude, I should say, is the title of the chapter. Excuse me, is a very violent tale about Mike during the course of his research as sort of a minor amateur historian, he talks to a guy that was 18 at the time this happened in the book. Now in Derry, as I said, historically most of the itinerant workers were French Canadian guys that came in and worked and then went on to the next thing. And in the book, there was a guy named Davy Hartwell who was trying to unionize the laborers in this particular area. But again, the powers that be did not like that. So he and 3 other men were massacred and chopped up and mutilated, and in the book it was just this terrible thing. And there was one guy, Claude Heroux, who managed to get away. But he hung around the camps and lived for a little while, but then one night he went into this bar in what was known at the time as Hell's Half Acre, which, by the way, the unincorporated kind of wild area where people would hang out and drink, there really was a Devil's Half Acre in early Bangor history, which I thought was kind of interesting. But he went in and he slaughtered the guys who he thought were responsible for his friends being murdered, right? And then in the book, Eru gets all of the guys that are in the bar that don't seem to notice or care when he's doing it or stop him. Then they decide to go out and lynch him in the book, right? Now, nothing quite that bloody happened in real history. But in Rhode Island, there was a riot between laborers protesting and striking, and the cops went in and shot them, and a number of the protesting workers died in this. It's considered a massacre. And there have been quite a few, there is quite a long history of labor disputes in the U.S., and that inspired a very fictionalized, very violent version of the history of labor dispute. But it could have easily gotten to that point if it had happened in Derry, where there's a monster working on people, right? So that was just what I wanted to kind of have a look at, the way that certain specters of real history, such as Prohibition, the Depression, labor dispute, the Ku Klux Klan, and racism, they informed a lot of Maine history and real-life events in Bangor, which then were fictionalized in it, which I found kind of interesting. And that's the part that has been left out of both adaptations, because they're focusing on the front story. Whereas if this series, Welcome to Derry, does end up happening, I think it'll be interesting. But I really think that if they want to make it historically accurate, they want to make it interesting. And maybe they would make it more interesting than I make it. I'm sorry, I'm not a compelling speaker about this stuff. But I think that it would be worth their while to look at real life Maine history and some of the things that inspired the events in the book, and to put them into a series about Derry and about the backstory and what made Pennywise, because he does feed on the evil in men's hearts. So I hope you enjoyed this dive into Derry, Maine, which is the fictional counterpart of the real-life Bangor, Maine, which does have quite a long and interesting history. I think, and if anything else, go look at the history of your own community, where you come from. Because I'm going to say where I come from, or where I live. Where I come from is Sarnia, which has its own history, but where I live now was largely settled by German butchers. So a number of the streets are named for the people that settled there. So the meats, a large slaughterhouse industry, and my own apartment is actually haunted. So I've been doing some research into the history just within a few square blocks. And there are quite a lot of ghosts rattling their chains around where I live. So you can check out my poltergeist videos for a little bit more on that. And if you're interested in more about the history of Maine, I'll put some links in the doobly-doo where I got some of this information. And I hope you're reading lots of great horror. Have a great day.